Hi guys, welcome to another episode of MrLopezClasses.com. We are going to continue in our course of transmissions, marine transmissions. In this particular chapter, this is the chapter 3, we are going to talk about the manual transmissions. And this chapter will be divided in 2 episodes. The first episode will be dedicated to the clutch, and we are going to analyze the clutch. What is the meaning of the clutch? In the second part, we are going to try to understand internally in the manual transmission how the gears work. What is the gear ratio for first gear, second gear, third gear, and reverse. And we are going to analyze the components internally in the manual transmission. Why we study in our course of marine transmission this transmission? Because if you understand this transmission and the automatic transmission, the next chapter, you understand easily the marine transmission, because the marine transmission is a perfect combination of both of them. Okay, in this episode we are going to analyze the clutch, and we are going to try to understand what is the function of the clutch and for what reason the clutch is necessary. The transmission, in order to understand how an inboard transmission works, we are going to study, like I explained before, both transmission, the manual and the automatic transmission at the same time. Both transmission, the manual transmission and the automatic transmission, at the end of the day, they do the same. But the procedure is completely different. Each transmission is completely different than the other one. Yes, the automatic transmission is a sophisticated hydraulic gearbox, and the marine transmission is hydraulic. It's a hydraulic unit, simple, because in marine transmission we only have one gear ratio for forward and other gear ratio for reverse. That's it. All right, my friends, we are going to check the components of the manual transmission, but basically we have an input shaft. The input shaft of the transmission, this shaft, is connected with the flywheel of the engine. This is the flywheel. The input shaft of the transmission release on the flywheel on the transmission, because the input shaft of the transmission enter in a small bearing located in the flywheel. That bearing is the pilot bearing. In the pilot bearing, the input shaft of the transmission release, in order to avoid play of the input shaft of the transmission. And the input shaft of the transmission at the end have connected the friction plate. Right now we are going to try to understand what is the meaning of that. The friction plate is spinning at the same time that the input shaft of the transmission. Okay, this is the input shaft of the transmission, and this is the output. And we have another shaft here, is the light shaft. We are going to try to understand what is the meaning of the light shaft or counter shaft. We have an input shaft, counter shaft, and output shaft. 3 shafts separated, and those shafts are separated because the diameter of the gears. For that reason, the manual transmissions are bigger transmission. The height of the transmission is high. In comparison with the automatic transmission that is narrow like a funnel. That's because of the different type of gears. In the manual transmission, we have 3 shafts separated for the gears. For that reason, we have some gears on the input shaft, other gear in the output shaft, and this is the light shaft, and other gears, depending of the diameter of those gears is the separation between the shafts. Okay, my friends, yes, the automatic transmission have this configuration. It's the engine here, the clutch, the transmission, the drive shaft, and the differential in the back. That's the differential. The differential receives the input shaft here, and the outputs are moving like this. That's the input shaft, and those are the output shafts moving each one in the same direction. All right. Okay, and the marine configuration is pretty similar to the automotive configuration. This is the marine configuration. Yes, we replace the end for the propeller. However, in the bell housing of the marine configuration, internally in the bell housing, we don't have a clutch, like the clutch that we are going to study right now. We have in the marine application a flex plate. You remember I explained a little in the previous episode the flex plate, but in the next coming episode I am going to explain the flex plate in details. And in order to understand what is the function of the flex plate, is an absorber. It's a vibration absorber, but it's not a clutch. Alright, but in both scenarios we have the bell housing. Inside of the bell housing, in automotive application, we have the clutch. Inside of the bell housing in marine application, we have the flex plate. Quiz question. Alright, my friends, this is the situation for marine application. And right now we are going to analyze the manual transmission, automotive transmission. And we are going to try to understand what is the meaning of that transmission. This is a perfect drawing about the connection in between the engine. If you see in this side we have the engine. This is the engine, and in this side we have the transmission. Okay, and it's wonderful because this is the bell housing, and the bell housing is in between this point and this point. Okay, and the rest is the transmission. Inside of the bell housing we have the clutch. If you see the clutch, we have the clutch pedal. That's the clutch pedal. When you apply the clutch pedal, you move back and forward the release bearing, the thrust bearing. That bearing compresses the pressure plate. When the pressure plate is compressed, this element goes out, and the friction material, the friction plate here is moving free. In that moment, with the shift control, you can organize the gears: first gear, second gear, third gear, because in this moment those shafts are independent. The input shaft of the transmission is not connected with the crankshaft of the engine. I am going to try to explain in the next video clip how the clutch works and the components of the clutch. Let me I verify quickly the components of the clutch. The clutch is composed by the pilot bearing, the pressure plate, the driving plate, the friction plate, and the clutch bearing, the pressure release bearing, or axial bearing, or thrust bearing. Okay, those are the components. Those are the components for the clutch, and we are going to analyze each of those components easily in the next coming episode. The clutch in a manual transmission, automotive transmission, is composed of three elements. The friction plate is a metallic plate, a steel plate, with a ceramic friction material in both sides. Some years ago, that friction material was in asbestos. Today, the friction material is a combination of different types of ceramics. And those pieces of ceramics are wrapped with pieces of copper. Ceramic in both sides, and this is the friction material. This element is connected always with the input shaft of the transmission. This element is spinning at the same speed that the input shaft of the transmission. Where is located the friction plate? The friction plate, this is the flywheel, and the flywheel is bolted on the crankshaft. This element is spinning against the face of the flywheel. When the transmission is disconnected with the engine, this element is spinning free. When the transmission is engaged with the engine, this element is together. Why? Because this is the other element, the pressure plate. The pressure plate is composed by one disc, metallic disc, with a flat surface that is in contact with the friction plate. The friction plate, at the end of the day, will be in contact between the pressure plate and the flywheel. The pressure plate is normally bolted is normally bolted on the flywheel. In other words, the pressure plate and the flywheel are bolted together always. They are bolted all the time. The pressure plate and the flywheel spin at the same speed because they are bolted together. In between both of them is located the friction disc, and the friction disc is free. The friction disc is free. The input shaft of the transmission enters over there, and the input shaft of the transmission is spinning the disc. Normally, this is the pressure plate. When the pressure plate, this is the thrust bearing. Remember, that's the bearing that is in permanent contact with these springs on the pressure plate. When this element is separated, when the thrust bearing is separated, this area is pressuring the friction disc with the flywheel. In other words, if the thrust bearing is separated, it's because the clutch pedal is not applied, and this element press the friction plate against the face of the flywheel, and the transmission is connected with the engine. When this element is compressed because you apply the clutch pedal, this element goes out, and the friction disc right now is spinning free, and the transmission is disconnected with respect to the engine. Once again, if the clutch pedal is applied, the thrust bearing is producing pressure on the springs, and this metal is moved back, and the friction plate is spinning free. If the clutch pedal is not applied, this element is separated, the thrust bearing is separated, and the pressure plate is pressuring the friction plate against the flywheel, and the engine is connected with the transmission. This is the function of the clutch, and this is a mechanical clutch. The bearing could be mechanical bearing and is moved by the fork of the clutch pedal, like the picture that you have on the screen. Remember that there are two types of thrust bearings. These bearings, the thrust bearings, is mechanical and is moved by the fork, according with the picture that you have on the screen right now. And this area is an axial bearing. This bearing is free, and this bearing is in permanent contact with the pressure plate. These elements are in permanent contact with the steels on the pressure plate, like the picture that you have on the screen. And this element is moved back and forward with the fork. When you apply the clutch pedal, this element goes forward, compress the pressure plate, and the friction disc is free. When you release the pressure plate, this element goes back, and the friction plate compress the friction disc, and the transmission is connected with the engine. When I apply the pressure plate, this element goes forward, compress the pressure plate, the friction disc will be free, and the input shaft of the transmission is free. In other words, the transmission is disconnected from the engine. This is mechanical thrust bearing, and this is hydraulic. This hydraulic works with hydraulic fluid. In this clutch, this element is located here and it's activated with the clutch. When I activate the clutch, I send the fluid from the reservoir, and I send the fluid, and the fluid enter here in the bearing, in the thrust bearing, and the thrust bearing compress the pressure plate or release the pressure plate. This is hydraulic, and the return is by a spring. Compress and return by a spring. This is hydraulic. When you apply the clutch pedal, the fluid from the reservoir activate the thrust bearing, and the thrust bearing is compressed or separate. Two types of thrust bearings: hydraulic or mechanical, and also electrical with a solenoid, like the picture that you have on the screen. Three types of thrust bearings for the same mechanical clutch.